Thanks, Mark, for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen right now with you guys. So what I want to cover today, as Mark mentioned, is what's going on, the interplay between platforms, really big players, and the auction in Google. So this is a tale of two giants, as I see it today, Google and Amazon. Before I get into it, just a short word about myself. As Mark mentioned, I'm product manager for a Google shopping management tool here at smec. I've got a long background in retail operations. I've done everything from driving a forklift in a brick and mortar operation through key account management, purchasing, delivery, all kinds of topics. And more recently, I'm really excited to work retail adjacent, supporting retailers. My job in product management is to, there's two roles: to build the right product and to build the product right. And my job is to make sure that we're building the right product. Just to get into the agenda for today, I'll take a look at the kind of macro picture based on some KPI benchmarking, what's going on in the auction environment in recent months, weeks and months, due to the disruption that we see from COVID-19. Then I'm going to look at giant number one, Amazon, giant number two, Google, and I'll wrap it up a bit. So this will be a higher level, more strategic talk, focusing on what these large entities are doing in the auction and what that means for you. So just to start with this macro picture. Oops. At the aggregate level, lockdown measures produced a bubble in shopping conversions. Let's see what that means. I've zoomed into some data here in a range from the week of February 24th through the week of May 4th, the first full week of May. And this range is really interesting because we can see a dotted line here before March 16th, the week of March 16th, and that's before most lockdown measures went into place in most European nations. And then we can see what happened after that line. And this data set is based on hundreds of retailers and merchants in different sectors across Europe. So just to see what to describe what we see here, this first slide focuses on the funnel metrics, the impressions down to the clicks, down to the conversions. So we can see that I would say the highlight here is what happened with conversions. There was, in week one, an immediate uptick, an immediate movement in conversions, and it reached a peak at up to 125% uplift in conversions. Different industries and different geos saw different things. This is a really big picture of what happened with the data. We can see that impressions peaked a couple weeks later, clicks also a bit later, and they didn't peak quite as high. So this is interesting. Why did conversions jump so fast? How did they stay more sustained, and what went on there? And this, of course, comes down to the rates. What happened to the funnel rates? Overall, we don't see as much variation. In this blue line here is the 2020 click-through rate. We don't see as much movement here, the super dramatic movement, although there's some movement there. And we see that it's below the 2019 benchmark. But what is really stunning is that there was an immediate reaction in conversion rate in Google Shopping as a result of these lockdown measures. People had a very heavy purchasing intent in those first days and weeks as they found themselves in lockdown, as they found themselves driven to e-commerce, to online retailers. And then what's interesting is that the conversion rate has slowly deflated until the point that it's actually below the 2019 benchmark. But what happened as that conversion rate was deflating, you have to remember that impressions and clicks were rising. So that's how the bubble got so sustained, because there was a rise in those volumes. And even though the rates were falling, they were still elevated year over year, and there was more traffic going through. What happened with CPCs, on the other hand, is that they mostly started declining. They continued declining, and there's been some volatility in the weeks since then, since the first week of May. But we still see that CPCs at an aggregate level are reduced compared to 2019 and compared to the period before lockdown. If you want to explore this data further, I can recommend that you can just Google smec Market Observer, or when I share these slides with you, you can click the link. This is a free data studio report. It's updated weekly with the freshest data that we have. There's no sign up, no email wall or anything, so I don't feel guilty promoting it to you. And also, I personally write an analysis on a bi-weekly basis that you'll find down at the bottom. So I hope you'll find that information interesting. So what we know is that there was a bubble and now we're entering a period of volatility. What happens next is a bit unclear, but I want to talk about what the platforms like Google and Amazon are doing in these circumstances. So this brings us to the first giant, Amazon's auction strategy. It's pretty simple as I see it. Amazon wants to capture market share on product searches, and they want to, of course, capture the users from Google. I have an interesting data set here. This, unfortunately, is not publicly available, but if you want to have a look at it, just reach out to me and I'll be glad to have a look at you, because this is an animated bubble chart. And what it does, it basically looks at 5 sectors and it looks at aggregated auction insights data for those sectors and sees how they change over time. That's what the animation reflects. So on the y-axis here, we see Amazon's outranking power. And on the x-axis, we see Amazon's overlap rate. The bubble radius or diameter is about Amazon's impression share. And if we look at the time pictured here, it's in January 2018. Amazon seemed like they were testing the waters. We can see that their outranking power was often quite strong, but the impression share was really small. The overlap rate was small. And it suggests that they were really in a testing mode. But as I've noted here, Amazon doesn't come to play. Amazon comes to win. And that explains what happened beginning around peak holiday season in November of 2019. This screenshot from the animation is taken from December. And Amazon just massively stepped up across the board. These are just 5 industries. This is based on German and UK data. But this type of pattern I've seen in the US in certain accounts. I've seen in basically anywhere you look. Amazon made a decision. They had been testing, they'd been learning, and they decided to just activate. So we've seen up to 66% impression share here, up to 70% overlap rate, and massive outranking power up to 85%, meaning that they're getting more premium slots in the auction. This can only be described as a loss leader strategy because it can't be directly profitable to bid the way that they're bidding. They're clearly bidding with maximum aggression, and they're operating with a different logic than most other merchants or advertisers out there. That's because their business goals are different. So when we try to understand why Amazon does this, I think it's pretty clear that they're not optimizing for something like ROAS that most advertisers have a pretty close eye on, or they calculate ROAS a bit differently. They're rather calculating for customer lifetime value for Amazon Prime subscriptions. This is a pretty genius or evil genius strategy from Bezos, pictured here. That's a real photo. I love it. It really captures his nature, I think. But what we see is it's a kind of a poison pill, because Google has this almost biological imperative to just swallow ad spend. The way that you or I eat food, Google, I have to look at the latest numbers, but I guess more than 75% of their revenue comes from advertising revenue, and they just need to consume this to keep growing. And they have no defense mechanism against that. So Amazon is able to just funnel ad spend in, and meanwhile, with every penny that they spend, they're working to build their exposure to users, to interfere with the product searches, and to start winning Amazon Prime subscriptions. So you can see why it's worthwhile to them to invest so heavily. For the rest of us, it's a real pain because it's very hard to handle that. I'll mention a couple things you might do, but first, let's talk about what might be next from Amazon. They notably exited the auction for a period of weeks during the coronavirus lockdown, but they're back in the auction at full strength in many markets, if not all, from what we've seen. And there's no sign of slowing down. They interestingly, data from Tinuiti suggests that they started withdrawing from the shopping auction all the way back in January. And I guess this was them already seeing the writing on the wall in terms of what might happen with coronavirus and making a strategic play well in advance of the actual lockdown measures. But since then, they did turn back on. They don't have these prioritized shipping anymore. And now we see that they're picking up back where they left off with expansion markets. Netherlands, they're very active here against their local competitor, bol.com. They have recently moved into Saudi Arabia. And as far as I know, they're not immediately active in Sweden yet, but they did purchase that domain a while ago. So it's something to watch out for. And in the coming months, I think what is most urgent to keep an eye on will be the headlines surrounding Amazon Prime Day. Because we know that it's not occurring in a usual window like June or July, and it's not quite clear when it will occur. I link here to an article from Kiri Masters, one of my favorite Amazon reporters, and she speculates if Amazon even needs to do Prime Day, but most people at this point, there's a consensus shaping that Amazon will bring Prime Day into play in September. A reason why it conflicts with their own back to school strategy if they would launch Prime Day in August, and in September seeming to be pretty attractive for them. This can and should worry you a bit because this is just potentially 2 months or less from Black Friday. And I think what's not clear yet is what's going to happen to consumer demand. I think a lot of advertisers right now are betting pretty hard that things will look really good for them later in this quarter and in Q4, and that the holidays will catch up a lot of revenue for them. But for me, this is not at all guaranteed because it will depend on the seasonality of the coronavirus and so on. If there's a second wave of the virus coming in September, October, but if something like that gets compounded by Prime Day, you've got these two magnets existing in September with Prime Day, and a lot of people matching with offers, and another magnet in Black Friday. And my concern with these kind of magnets is that I don't know that they necessarily increase overall conversions or revenue. I'm very skeptical that they somehow generate more sales or incremental consumer sales. I have the feeling that they instead consolidate consumer shopping activity into these focal points where margin tends to be lower because of all the discounts that are running. So this is definitely something to keep an eye on. At any rate, Amazon is applying this brute force strategy with very high CPCs. They're competing on a level that most of the rest of us just can't match. And the question is, what can you do about it? At a really high level, what I can recommend is being targeted, being agile, kind of a fleet versus armada tactic. Excuse me. That means to me using a product specific structure so that you're as granular as possible. I think it's critical to avoid average data that comes up when you're not using the right level of granularity in your campaigns or in your account structure. When you're product specific, it allows you to really know what's going on with different products and address them quite specifically. And in Amazon, you will probably need to pick which battles you want to take on Amazon at a product level and which battles not. And therefore having a product specific strategy or structure is really essential for that. Query level strategies are also to me highly valuable. You have to remember that Amazon has a massive amount of proprietary audience data. So I guess, for example, that their remarketing lists are super powerful. And there's only so much that you can do in the Google environment regarding audience targeting. I think that query level bidding, for example, can help you get that level of specificity that you need. And it's about de-averaging, because even if you're product specific, you're then bidding the same, for example, a generic query like Nike shoes versus a highly specific query with it purchasing intent in it, like buy Nike's running shoes black, size 43 men's or something like that. I also strongly recommend incorporating margin data into your account, not necessarily through the COGS attribute that you might have seen in Google Ads. It depends if you're comfortable sharing your COGS with Google, I guess not. But nevertheless, through custom labels or other shielded ways of sharing your margin data, this allows you to, again, pick the right battles where you can survive competitive auctions. And lastly, benchmark pricing can be really effective to understand, particularly where Amazon tends to lead on pricing. You might know where your pricing is just not going to be competitive against theirs, or where you have an advantage. This brings us to the second giant, Google. Google's strategy in a nutshell, as I see it right now, is to simplify shopping. And the second part is to gain more control of the environment, end-to-end control. I'll explain what I mean. First, I think that this chart can really help us understand what's going on with Google's strategy. I see a couple of different dimensions here. What's going on with merchant adoption and what's going on with consumer adoption. So let's look at point one here. What we have here is a curve that's showing the rate of adoption over time. And what we see is that merchant adoption is starting to shrink. Google has been very successful at onboarding merchants to Google Shopping over time. I don't think there are many big players left who aren't on Google Shopping. I don't think there are any medium players left who are not on Google Shopping. But that means that there's still considerable revenue opportunity for Google in the late adopters. Tricky thing is that it's tougher to tap that market. Those will tend to be really smaller businesses where they look at Google Shopping and they say it's too complicated, it's too challenging. And we'll get back to Google's answer to that. Meanwhile, we see at a different kind of stage of adoption what's going on with consumer adoption of the shopping property. And that, I don't just mean clicking on PLAs in the Google search, but I mean actually visiting the shopping tab, the shopping property itself, and using that. And this is at a point where adoption is low. It's hopefully for Google, it's growing, but they have major challenges ahead. This is where they can challenge Amazon on the consumer side, but they will face this gap here before they can really gain traction there. They'll face challenges related to the customer experience, related to fulfillment, logistics, related to the way consumers even perceive their brand. They're not perceived as a marketplace or as an e-commerce destination. But for right now, I want to get into a little more detail on what's happening with merchant adoption, since I think that's most relevant for everyone here. You probably heard a couple months ago now, some headlines from the US about free clicks in shopping. There were some kind of bad headlines at first that shopping might be free now. It's really important to emphasize that only clicks in the shopping tab will become free. And this is basically part of the Surfaces Across Google program. These free clicks were marketed as kind of a way to support retailers during COVID-19, but actually this is part of a long-standing strategy from Google. And their goal here is that they know they're hemorrhaging, they're losing a lot of product search volume to Amazon, so they need to reevaluate the kind of the real estate that they have and how they can maximize that real estate and make it count. So these are the surfaces across their different user interfaces. A prominent one, of course, being the shopping tab. And what they've done here, they're making the clicks free. The impressions are generated via algorithm. And the idea is that merchants can create or would-be merchants can create a merchant center, and they don't need to spend anything, but they can get some free conversion volume from Google. And clearly this is a way of taking people who haven't adopted shopping yet, get them in the door with a merchant center. And over time, I think Google's expectation is that they can slowly but surely start spending once they see what Google Shopping can do for them, generating conversion value. I'll mention that algorithmic generated impressions are not unknown in the shopping environment. That's been the status quo for a while now in India, but there's a kind of a different history there. And I invite you to read more about the topic in the linked blog post. On a few of my slides, you'll see some resources that you can check out when I share the slides. A big question mark is how incremental will this really be for merchants? It all depends on what is the click share of the shopping tab. It seems like most clicks are coming through the SERP, and I've seen estimates as high as 10% on the shopping tab, but I think it's unlikely. If you really put a gun to my head, I would probably say it will depend on industry, it will depend on geography. Fashion, for example, might be a higher click share, but I would guess it's more around 3%. There will be data about this coming from someone sometime soon, I'm sure about that. We don't have that many accounts in the US, or we'd be working on it right now. But what's important to note is that running through the shopping tab, unless people are visiting it as a traffic destination, it lengthens the conversion funnel. They have to make a product search or product-like query, then they have to click on that shopping tab button, and then they need to scroll down past the paid ads, which are still in the top real estate, and then they can finally click on one of these free ads. And we'll see what comes out of that. I guess that someone who has gone further through that funnel, typically when someone's passing through a conversion funnel, each surviving cohort has higher purchasing intent. They're more qualified as a buyer. So therefore the conversion rate of these on your landing page might be higher, but also they've had a chance to apply potentially some product-like filters in the shopping tab. So they might have kind of gotten their browsing energy out of them, and they might be, since the conversion rate is higher, they might be ready to buy, and then you might see lower basket values. It needs to be studied more in detail. What I can definitely recommend is checking out Kirk Williams' resource. He has a detailed blog post that shows you how you can measure this stuff. Bearing in mind, it's not rolled out to Europe yet, but maybe some of you are targeting the US, and at any rate, we see that the Surfaces program is rolling out soon and starting to roll out already. And they've suggested, Google has more or less promised that this will roll out worldwide by the end of the year. Now, when we get back to this topic of how will Google drive more adoption of the Merchant Center, another core strategy for them is smart shopping, because they've designed something that is super easy to use and actually allows no hands-on management. The advantages of smart shopping campaigns compared to standard shopping are quite clear. It has really great reach, additional reach, and that reach has unusual attributes to it. Let's say these dynamic remarketing and dynamic prospecting, these are powered by Google's extremely significant audience signals. So that can be really valuable. I don't want to diminish that. What bugs me a little bit is that the promotional controls are largely missing at that point. And this can be pretty challenging for a retailer or a merchant when they want to have a certain level of strategic control of what's going on in their account, or if they don't know what to do next because the levers are all missing. I also see that the competitive differentiation is rather low due to structuring possibilities. The default is that there's a single ad campaign and a single ad group. And like I mentioned, I'm a strong advocate for granular product-specific structures that are way more powerful than that. My fear here is that it's very hard to differentiate a competitor with similar assortment, pricing, and probably similar ROAS goals as yourself, because this will end up putting a lot of pressure on that ROAS. Just a quick detour about that. I really love this quote from Avinash Kaushik. He's head of strategic analytics at Google, and he describes ROAS as a navel-gazing, advertising-centric metric, not a business metric. I agree with that assessment completely. I think that ROAS is part of a closed system, so by its nature, it's very circular, self-referential. On the one hand, it's very available, it's very standardized. People at least think they understand it, but in conversations all the time, and even in Google's marketing and promotional materials, I see ROAS described as a way of measuring profit, and that's just not the case. It's all about top line revenue, and there's no specific anchor to your margin in there. So I always warn that ROAS alone is dangerous to use. You need to be able to integrate other kinds of business data in there. Back to this differentiation topic, the problem that I see over time is that while you might get some level of differentiation with smart shopping campaigns now, as adoption rises and as saturation rises, because Google, their goal here is to drive a lot more merchants entering the auction, granted small merchants, but over time, this is going to make it really hard to stay differentiated when you're missing those promotional settings, when you're missing the structuring possibilities. Big question mark for me, more than that, is how is Google themselves going to handle that? And this is where I get to this idea of end-to-end control of the environment. It might actually be necessary for them at some point, because really it's a significant challenge to figure out how to differentiate between nearly identical merchants with nearly identical structures and nearly identical goals. There's no machine learning that can just solve that problem magically. So there's this concept that we discovered from DeepMind research. Remember, DeepMind is owned by Google. And they're investigating these interesting mechanisms called truthful auctions, which are usually used in a nonprofit context. But the idea is that, for example, what Amazon is doing with a loss leader strategy would be impossible. You would need to make an honest valuation, or they might be able to make their own assessment, their own valuation of what a conversion is worth to you. And then basically, rather than bidding, they would just sort conversions through, and you would have, you just basically pay a monthly bill at that point, and you'd get the number of conversions that you got. They're looking to absorb more and more information, including merchants' first-party information, like margin or COGS, like pricing. They're looking to understand this more and control as many levers as they can in the auction, because they need to just juice that auction for every penny that it's worth so that they can keep growing in terms of revenue. It's a totally understandable position, but I think it's a little troubling from a merchant standpoint, because I've always valued the independence that Google Shopping offers, and this is headed in a very different direction than that. Coming back to what can you do, I still recommend all these things as before, and I would just note that it's really only possible to have this level of sophistication with standard shopping campaigns. I see them as the way forward for now. And just to wrap it up, because I think I'm either out of time or almost out of time, a couple things that I'd like to mention, some key messages, let's call them like that. I see that saturation is rising, like we've discussed. Google is, from a product strategy standpoint, they're probably going to continue taking away levers and control options that you have. At some point, we might not be able to have a plan B or another option. And one of the last things that's impacting that click-through rate and that conversion rate is your brand. So I also recommend, if you're not strong on your upper funnel measures, your branding measures, now is the time to do that. You're going to put way too much pressure on your performance marketing, on your Google Shopping, if you don't have a strong brand backing it up. Again, I highly recommend you to rethink ROAS and ask if it's really serving your business the way it should right now. I would look for a more margin-based approach to bidding. And on a related topic, your first-party data, you should treasure it. That means keeping it safe, sharing it with partners that you trust and where you understand and know how and why they're going to use it, and then making it count. for example, delivering bidding strategies based on things like return rates, margin level, stock level, and so on. This stuff can be really powerful. And as I mentioned, I hate to be a little bit of a pessimist, but I wouldn't bet too heavily on Q4 right now. For me, it's a big question mark what's going to happen there in terms of the overall economic picture, in terms of the recovery. I think the good news is that what sales do occur, and hopefully it's a lot, they'll definitely be in e-commerce more than ever. But I also recommend that you don't sleep on your budget now. Now, things are in many European nations, a little less so in the UK currently, but things are relatively stable, and I think you need to step into it and get what you can. And last note for me, there is kind of a third giant here. I don't know. I couldn't decide if I should call him the friendly giant or the sleeping giant, but it's Microsoft. And this can be a way to reach more users. If you're not reaching them now, now is the perfect time to adopt Microsoft. The market observer that I showed you at the beginning also has data from Microsoft. What I really love about Microsoft, they're in a much less compromised position than Google. They're in a less competitive situation against Amazon. This kind of revenue for them, it's not their core business, the ad revenue, it's on top for them. So it's an opportunity. And this makes a world of difference because it changes how they'll act as a partner. It changes how they'll act as a platform. So I definitely recommend checking out Microsoft. That's everything I wanted to say for right now. Thank you guys so much. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and hand over to Indy or Indipal. Thank you.